Chapter 13. The Evidence of Appearances. Was Jesus seen alive after his death on the cross? In 1963, the body of 14-year-old Addie Mae Collins, one of 4 African-American girls tragically murdered in an infamous church bombing by white racists, was buried in Birmingham, Alabama. For years, family members kept returning to the grave to pray and leave flowers. In 1998, they made the decision to disinter the deceased for reburial at another cemetery. When workers were sent to dig up the body, however, they returned with a shocking discovery. The grave was empty. Understandably, family members were terribly distraught. Hampered by poorly kept records, cemetery officials scrambled to figure out what had happened. Several possibilities were raised, the primary one being that her tombstone had been erected in the wrong place. Yet in the midst of determining what happened, one explanation was never proposed. Nobody suggested that young Addie Mae had been resurrected to walk the earth again. Why? Because by itself, an empty grave does not a resurrection make. My conversation with Dr. William Lane Craig had already elicited powerful evidence that the tomb of Jesus was empty the Sunday after his crucifixion. While I knew that this was important and necessary evidence for his resurrection, I was also aware that a missing body is not conclusive proof by itself. More facts would be needed to establish that Jesus really did return from the dead. That's what prompted my plane trip to Virginia. As my flight gently banked over the wooded hills below, I was doing some last-minute reading of a book by Michael Martin, the Boston University professor who had sought to discredit Christianity. I smiled at his words. Perhaps the most sophisticated defense of the resurrection to date has been produced by Gary Habermas. I glanced at my watch. I would land with just enough time to rent a car, drive to Lynchburg, and make my 2 o'clock appointment with Habermas himself. The 12th interview. Gary Habermas, Ph.D., D.D. 2 autographed photos of hockey players, shown in flat-out combat on ice, hang on the walls of Habermas's austere office. One features the immortal Bobby Hull of the Chicago Blackhawks. The other depicts Dave the Hammer Schultz, the brawling, tough-as-nails forward for the Philadelphia Flyers. Hull is my favorite hockey player, explains Habermas. Schultz is my favorite fighter. He grinned, then added, "There's a difference." Habermas, bearded, straight-talking, rough-hewn, is also a fighter, an academic pit bull who looks more like a nightclub bouncer than an ivory tower intellectual. Armed with razor-sharp arguments and historical evidence to back them up, he's not afraid to come out swinging. Antony Flew, one of the leading philosophical atheists in the world, found that out when he tangled with Habermas in a major debate on the topic, "Did Jesus rise from the dead?" The results were decidedly one-sided. Of the 5 independent philosophers from various colleges and universities who served as judges of the debate's content, 4 concluded that Habermas had won. 1 called the contest a draw. None cast a ballot for Flew. Commented one judge, "I was surprised, shocked might be a more accurate word, to see how weak Flew's own approach was. I was left with this conclusion. Since the case against the resurrection was no stronger than that presented by Antony Flew, I would think it was time I began to take the resurrection seriously." One of 5 other professional debate judges who evaluated the contestants' argumentation techniques, again, Habermas was the victor, felt compelled to write, "I conclude that the historical evidence, though flawed, is strong enough to lead reasonable minds to conclude Christ did indeed rise from the dead." Habermas does end up providing highly probable evidence for the historicity of the resurrection with no plausible naturalistic evidence against it. Habermas, therefore, in my opinion, wins the debate. After earning a doctorate from Michigan State University, where he wrote his dissertation on the resurrection, Habermas received a Doctor of Divinity degree from Emmanuel College in Oxford, England. He has authored 7 books dealing with Jesus rising from the dead, including The Resurrection of Jesus, A Rational Inquiry, The Resurrection of Jesus, an Apologetic, The Historical Jesus, and Did Jesus Rise from the Dead, The Resurrection Debate, which was based on his debate with Flew. Among his other books are Dealing with Doubt, and with J.P. Moreland, Beyond Death, Exploring the Evidence for Immortality. In addition, he co-edited In Defense of Miracles and contributed to Jesus Under Fire and Living Your Faith, Closing the Gap Between Mind and Heart. His 100 articles have appeared in popular publications, such as the Saturday Evening Post, scholarly journals, including Faith and Philosophy and Religious Studies, and reference books, for example, the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology. He's also the former president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. I don't mean to suggest by my earlier description that Habermas is unnecessarily combative. He's friendly and self-effacing in casual conversations. I just wouldn't want to be on the other side of a hockey puck or an argument from him. He has an innate radar that helps him zero in on his opponent's vulnerable points. He also has a tender side, which I would discover quite unexpectedly before our interview was over. I found Habermas in his no-nonsense office at Liberty University, where he is currently Distinguished Research Professor of Apologetics and Philosophy at the School of Divinity. The room, with its black file cabinets, metal desk with simulated wood top, threadbare carpet, and folding guest chairs, is certainly no showplace. Like its occupant, it's free from pretension. Habermas, sitting behind his desk, rolled up the sleeves of his blue button-down shirt as I turned on my tape recorder and started our interview. "Isn't it true," I began with prosecutorial bluntness, "that there are absolutely no eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection?" "That's exactly right. There's no descriptive account of the resurrection," Habermas replied, in an admission that might surprise people who only have a casual knowledge of the subject. "When I was young, I was reading a book by C.S. Lewis, who wrote that the New Testament says nothing about the resurrection. I wrote a big no in the margin. Then I realized what he was saying. Nobody was sitting inside the tomb and saw the body start to vibrate, stand up, take the linen wrappings off, fold them, roll back the stone, wow the guards, and leave. That, it seemed to me, might pose some problems. Doesn't this hurt your efforts to establish that the resurrection is a historical event?" I asked. Habermas pushed back his chair to get more comfortable. "No, this doesn't hurt our case one iota, because science is all about causes and effects. We don't see dinosaurs. We study fossils. We may not know how a disease originates, but we study its symptoms. Maybe nobody witnesses a crime, but police piece together the evidence after the fact. So," he continued, "here's how I look at the evidence for the resurrection. First, did Jesus die on the cross? And second, did he appear later to people? If you can establish those two things, you've made your case, because dead people don't normally do that." Historians agree there's plenty of evidence that Jesus was crucified, and Dr. Alexander Metherell demonstrated in an earlier chapter that Jesus could not have survived the rigors of that execution. That leaves the second part of the issue. Did Jesus really appear later? What evidence is there that people saw him? I asked. "I'll start with evidence that virtually all critical scholars will admit," he said, opening the Bible in front of him. "Nobody questions that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and we have him affirming in 2 places that he personally encountered the resurrected Christ. He says in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 1, 'Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?' And he says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 8, 'Last of all, he appeared to me also.'" I recognize that last quote as being attached to the early church creed that Craig Blomberg and I have already discussed. As William Lane Craig indicated, the first part of the creed, verses 3 through 4, refers to Jesus' execution, burial, and resurrection. The final part of the creed, verses 5 through 8, deals with his post-resurrection appearances. Christ appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. In the next verse, Paul adds, "And last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born." On the face of it, this is incredibly influential testimony that Jesus did appear alive after his death. Here were the names of specific individuals and groups of people who saw him, written at a time when people could still check them out if they wanted confirmation. Since I knew that the creed would be pivotal in establishing the resurrection, I decided to subject it to greater scrutiny. Why are historians convinced it's a creed? How trustworthy is it? How far back does it go? "Do you mind if I cross-examine you on this creed?" I asked Habermas. He extended his hand as if to invite the inquiry. "Please," he said politely, "go ahead." Initially, I wanted to determine why Habermas, Craig, Blomberg, and others are convinced that this passage is a creed of the early church, and not just the words of Paul, who wrote the letter to the Corinthian church in which it's contained. My challenge to Habermas was simple and direct. Convince me it's a creed. Well, I can give you several solid reasons. First, Paul introduces it with the words received and delivered, or passed on in the NIV, which are technical rabbinic terms indicating he's passing along holy tradition. Second, Habermas said, looking down at his hands as he grabbed a finger at a time to emphasize each point he was making, the text's parallelism and stylized content indicate it's a creed. Third, the original text uses Cephas for Peter, which is his Aramaic name. In fact, the Aramaic itself could indicate a very early origin. Fourth, the creed uses several other primitive phrases that Paul would not customarily use, like the 12, the third day, he was raised, and others. Fifth, the use of certain words is similar to Aramaic and Mishnaic Hebrew means of narration. Having run out of fingers, he looked up at me. "Should I go on?" he asked. Okay, I said. "You're saying that these facts convince you as a conservative evangelical Christian that this is an early creed." Habermas seemed a bit offended by that admittedly barbed remark. "It's not just conservative Christians who are convinced," he insisted indignantly. "This is an assessment that's shared by a wide range of scholars from across a broad theological spectrum. The eminent scholar Joachim Jeremias refers to this creed as the earliest tradition of all, and Ulrich Wilkins says it indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity." That raised the question of how primitive the creed is. "How far back can you date it?" I asked. We know that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around AD 55 and 57. He indicates in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4, that he has already passed on this creed to the church at Corinth, which would mean it must predate his visit there in AD 51. Therefore, the creed was being used within 20 years of the resurrection, which is quite early. However, I'd agree with the various scholars who trace it back even further, to within 2 to 8 years of the resurrection, or from about AD 32 to 38, when Paul received it either in Damascus or Jerusalem. So this is incredibly early material, primitive, unadorned testimony to the fact that Jesus appeared alive to skeptics like Paul and James, as well as to Peter and the rest of the disciples. In fact, I would learn later that prominent New Testament scholar James D.G. Dunn of the University of Durham, a fellow of the British Academy, said, "This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death." But, I protested, it's not really a first-hand account. Paul is providing the list second or third hand. Doesn't that diminish its value as evidence? not to Habermas. Keep in mind that Paul personally affirms that Jesus appeared to him as well, so this provides first-hand testimony. And Paul didn't just pick up this list from strangers on the street. The leading view is that he got it directly from the eyewitnesses Peter and James themselves, and he took great pains to confirm its accuracy. That was a strong claim. How do you know that? I asked. I would concur with the scholars who believe Paul received this material 3 years after his conversion, when he took a trip to Jerusalem and met with Peter and James. Paul describes that trip in Galatians 1, verses 18 and 19, where he uses a very interesting Greek word, historio. I wasn't familiar with the meaning of the word. Why is that significant? Because this word indicates that he didn't just casually shoot the breeze when he met with them. It shows this was an investigative inquiry. Paul was playing the role of an examiner, someone who was carefully checking this out. So the fact that Paul personally confirmed matters with 2 eyewitnesses who are specifically mentioned in the Creed, Peter and James, gives this extra weight. One of the few Jewish New Testament scholars, Pinchas Lapide, said, "The evidence in support of the Creed is so strong that it may be considered as a statement of eyewitnesses." Richard Bauckham, senior scholar at Ridley Hall in Cambridge, said, "There can be no doubt that Paul is citing the eyewitness testimony of those who were recipients of resurrection appearances." Before I could jump in, Habermas added, and later in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11, Paul emphasizes that the other apostles agreed in preaching the same gospel, this same message about the resurrection. This means that what the eyewitness Paul is saying is the exact same thing that the eyewitnesses Peter and James are saying. I'll admit it. All this sounded pretty convincing. Still, I had some reservations about the Creed, and I didn't want Habermas's confident assertions to deter me from probing further. The Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place in ancient literature where it is claimed that Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. The Gospels don't corroborate it. No secular historian mentions it, and to me, that raises a yellow flag. If this really happened, why doesn't anyone else talk about it? I asked Habermas. You'd think the apostles would cite this as evidence wherever they went. As the atheist Michael Martin says, one must conclude that it is extremely unlikely that this incident really occurred, and that this, therefore, indirectly casts doubt on Paul as a reliable source. That remark bothered Habermas. Well, it's just plain silliness to say this casts doubt on Paul, he replied, sounding both astonished and annoyed that someone would make that claim. I mean, give me a break. First, even though it's only reported in one source, it just so happens to be the earliest and best authenticated passage of all. That counts for something. Second, Paul apparently had some proximity to these people. He says, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Paul either knew some of these people, or was told by someone who knew them that they were still walking around and willing to be interviewed. Now, stop and think about it. You would never include this phrase unless you were absolutely confident that these folks would confirm that they really did see Jesus alive. I mean, Paul was virtually inviting people to check it out for themselves. He wouldn't have said this if he didn't know they'd back him up. Third, when you have only one source, you can ask, why aren't there more? But you can't say this one source is crummy on the grounds that someone else didn't pick up on it. You can't downgrade this one source that way. So this doesn't cast any doubt on Paul at all. Believe me, Martin would love to be able to do that, but he can't do it legitimately. This is an example of how some critics want it both ways. Generally, they denigrate the gospel resurrection accounts in favor of Paul, since he is taken as the chief authority. But on this issue, they're questioning Paul for the sake of texts that they don't trust as much in the first place. What does this say about their methodology? I was still having trouble envisioning this appearance by Jesus to such a large crowd. Where would this encounter with 500 people have taken place, I asked. Well, the Galilean countryside, Habermas speculated. If Jesus could feed 5,000, he could preach to 500. And Matthew does say Jesus appeared on a hillside. Maybe more than just the 11 disciples were there. Picturing that scene in my mind, I still couldn't help but wonder why someone else didn't report on this event. Wouldn't it be likely that the historian Josephus would have mentioned something of that magnitude? No, I don't think that's necessarily true. Josephus was writing 60 years afterward. How long do local stories circulate before they start to die out? Habermas asked. So either Josephus didn't know about it, which is possible, or he chose not to mention it, which would make sense because we know Josephus was not a follower of Jesus. You can't expect Josephus to start building the case for him. When I didn't respond for a moment, Habermas continued, Look, I'd love to have 5 sources for this. I don't. But I do have one excellent source, a creed that's so good that German historian Hans von Koppenhausen says this account meets all the demands of historical reliability that could possibly be made of such a text. Besides, you don't need to rely on the reference of the 500 to make the case for the resurrection. Usually, I don't even use it. Habermas's answer carried some logic. Still, there was another aspect of the creed that weighed on me. It says Jesus appeared first to Peter, whereas John said he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. In fact, the creed doesn't mention any women, even though they're prominently featured in the gospel accounts. Don't these contradictions hurt its credibility? I asked. No, came the reply. First of all, look at the creed carefully. It doesn't say Jesus appeared first to Peter. All it does is put Peter's name first on the list. And since women were not considered competent as witnesses in first-century Jewish culture, it's not surprising that they're not mentioned here. In the first-century scheme of things, their testimony wouldn't carry any weight. So placing Peter first could indicate logical priority rather than temporal priority. Again, he concluded, the creed's credibility remains intact. You've raised some questions, but wouldn't you concede that they don't undermine the persuasive evidence that the creed is early, that it's free from legendary contamination, that it's unambiguous and specific, and that it's ultimately rooted in eyewitness accounts? All in all, I was forced to agree that he was right. The weight of the evidence clearly and convincingly supports the creed as being powerful evidence for Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. So powerful that William Lane Craig, the resurrection expert I interviewed in the previous chapter, said that the late Wolfhart Pannenberg, perhaps the greatest systematic theologian in the world, rocked modern skeptical German theology by building his entire theology precisely on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as supplied in Paul's list of appearances. Having satisfied myself about the essential reliability of the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, it was time to begin looking at the 4 Gospels, which recount the various appearances by the resurrected Jesus in more detail. I started this line of inquiry by asking Habermas to describe the post-resurrection appearances in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are several different appearances to a lot of different people in the Gospel and Acts, some individually, some in groups, sometimes indoors, sometimes outdoors, to soft-hearted people like John and skeptical people like Thomas, he began. At times they touched Jesus or ate with him, with the text teaching that he was physically present. These appearances occurred over several weeks, and there are good reasons to trust these accounts. For example, they're lacking in many typical mythical tendencies. Can you enumerate these appearances for me? From memory, Habermas described them one at a time. Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene in John 20, verses 10 through 18, to the other women in Matthew 28, verses 8 through 10, to Cleopas and another disciple on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, verses 13 through 32,